So we see these terms like occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide. And these are ultimately as false as the ancient blood libel, the allegation that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual. When you have UN-run schools that indoctrinate kindergarten children to believe that the highest calling in life is to kill as many Jews as possible, peace is being pushed further and further away.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes, and I'm delighted to be joined in conversation with Natasha Hausdorff. Welcome.
Thank you, Fraser. It's good to be with you.
Natasha, you're a barrister, expert in international law, legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel of the Charitable Trust. You're often on our TV screens defending Israel against what is probably the most serious crime possible. I'm talking, of course, about genocide. Some people might say you're defending the indefensible. How would you answer that?
Well, I certainly see myself as defending the proper application of international law and the rule of law, first and foremost. In this respect, unfortunately, the allegation of genocide being levied against Israel is an inversion, both of that concept, that international crime, but also of the legal framework. So the two go hand in hand with the abuse of international law more generally against Israel. We certainly see it in stark terms in terms of South Africa's allegation of genocide at the International Court of Justice. And I think the motivations behind South Africa's allegation are extremely political. But the use of the term genocide in this respect is actually a technical legal hook to bring Israel to the court, because the State of Israel is a signatory to the Genocide Convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide. And thus, South Africa, in terms of bringing this unfounded, untrue allegation, is seeking to ground a legal case against Israel in the context of the jurisdictional framework of the International Court of Justice.
Can you explain in sort of layman's terms, what is genocide and why is it a mistake to label Israel's actions in that way?
Well, the term arose after the Holocaust. It was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish jurist, to provide a legal terminology to the Jewish experience of being exterminated, targeted because they were Jews. And so the central element of the crime of genocide, which is defined in Article 2 of the Convention, and it's also reflected in the International Criminal Court statute. The critical element of the crime is intention to destroy an ethnic, national, racial, religious group in whole or in part. And it's that intention which is then manifested through the commission of a series of acts, including killing individuals of that group or creating the conditions that make life impossible. But ultimately, what makes the crime of genocide different from any other international crime is the intention to go after a group in whole or in part.
And what kind of evidence do people bring to make that case, and why would you say that's wrong?
Well, the evidence that South Africa sought to put before the court included quotes by Israeli politicians that had been unfortunately taken out of context. So, for example, where remarks were being made about going after Hamas terrorists, the suggestion was that these remarks were applicable to the Palestinian people more generally. So that was the only evidence that South Africa sought to advance in terms of intention. And then other than that, we had essentially a series of blood libels that were being advanced by the South African legal team at the ICJ. Unfortunately, it chimes with what the media has presented over the last 12 months and the information coming out of the Gaza Strip in particular. What we have to understand is that there is no reporting that comes out of Gaza that is not controlled by Hamas in some way, shape or form. There are a number of journalists with real integrity who have come out and have made that clear, that inevitably anyone operating within the Gaza Strip, even in the last 12 months, has been extremely fearful of what Hamas do if you don't toe their particular line, the line of an internationally prescribed terrorist organization. And while that's applicable to journalists having to operate out of Gaza, it's also unfortunately applicable to international humanitarian organizations, many of which have been infiltrated by Hamas. Hamas is using, of course, the cover of UNRWA in a variety of respects. And what we see, therefore, is the information coming out of Gaza, which has been essentially part of the propaganda exercise of this internationally prescribed terrorist organization, being then used in the context of these pseudo-legal arguments that have been advanced, including by South Africa at the ICJ.
You accused South Africa of blood libel. Now, people may know the sort of medieval context of this. What do you mean by that in the modern context?
So the medieval context was the allegation that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual. And I think what many people probably don't realise is how widely believed that was in medieval times. Even now, in some parts of the Arab world, that ancient blood libel is still on full display. I remember watching reports on Al Arabiya years ago referencing supposed massacres of Christian children in Paris in the 1800s. So those ancient libels are pervasive, but they are here in an updated form in the context of international law and how it's being abused. So we see these terms like occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide. And these are ultimately as false as the ancient blood libel, but as pervasive, as widely believed. They're here in an updated form. And in many respects, while religion was the order of the day in terms of the ancient blood libel, and so, religious ritual was the mechanism by which that hatred of the Jews was then projected. That's in many respects been overtaken. International law, human rights being the current order of the day, the modern blood libels fall into the mechanism of international law, but albeit it's international law that is being used and that sort of language and terminology that is being abused to promote these modern falsehoods, you see, I think, the way that this is being lapped up in terms of the narrative, both in terms of the traditional media and also in social media. Yeah. And it was actually the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, the late Lord Jonathan Sacks, who had the foresight to point out that these modern blood libels were being advanced in the framework of international law, and to point out, in fact, that the modern virus, or the mutating virus of anti-Semitism, I should say, in its modern form, focused on the Jewish state and particularly abused international law for that purpose.
And I suppose in particular, the meme, I guess, is Israel killing children, killing Palestinian children, deliberately out of some sort of psychotic bloodlust or something like that.
That's spot on. And I think we need to be absolutely clear, albeit that enormously, unfortunately, there have been children who have been casualties of the conflict in Gaza. This allegation that Israel deliberately targets them is entirely untrue. That element is the blood libel. Quite the contrary, what is seemingly unreported in terms of Hamas's abuses of its own people, both in the last 12 months, but critically since it violently took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, the manner in which it has treated children. There have been reports of children being used to dig some of the tunnel network, the terror infrastructure that Hamas instituted. Reports also of real brutality against Palestinian civilians, and executions, torture of Palestinian civilians. And in many respects, there's another level here. So there are the falsehoods that are projected onto Israel, but then there's also the inversion and the projection of Hamas brutality onto Israel as well. And those, I believe, are working in tandem and fueling so much of the misinformation.
Yeah, it does often feel, certainly in the media discussion, that Hamas has no agency whatsoever. Everything is directed by Israel, where, regardless of what's happening. Even some people believe the 7th of October was part of either an Israeli plot deliberately stirred up or deliberately allowed to happen in order to, justify this invasion of
the conspiracy
Gaza.
Theories run deep, absolutely.
Yeah. To pick up on another one of these legal terms that is often thrown around against Israel, apartheid. Obviously, we know what that's meant to evoke. Why is it wrong to use it in the Israeli context?
Proving the negative is always, a difficult place to start from. Anyone who has visited Israel and witnessed the type of country it is would give this allegation short shrift. It is being advanced again for a particular reason. When I said genocide was the legal hook which South Africa used to bring the case against Israel at the ICC, apartheid is used as a hook because of a precedent, because apartheid in South Africa came with the inevitable consequence, which was boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
Yeah.
And so the allegation is a very calculated one. It is utterly untrue. Within Israel, which is a country in which the rule of law has paramount importance, equality exists between all Israeli citizens. I mean, when I was working at the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, I was clerking for the late President Miriam Naor of the court. I also worked under an Arab justice, one, in fact, who put both a Jewish prime minister and a Jewish president behind bars. The notion that there is some institutional structure by which Israeli citizens who are of Arab origin are discriminated against is entirely false. What many so-called human rights organizations have done in order to seek to justify their use of the term with respect to Israel is, and it's very similar to the issue that you've just brought up, of infantilizing the Palestinians.
Yeah.
They have eradicated the existence of the Palestinian autonomy, which exists in the West Bank in areas A and B, and the Palestinian Authority have jurisdiction, if you will, there under the Oslo Accords, and also the existence of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the autonomy that exists there. And we've seen, unfortunately, the consequences of that. Now, these are Palestinians living within those areas who are not Israeli citizens and who should be voting for their political representatives. Unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas is in the 19th year of his 4-year term, and of course Hamas have ruled in Gaza brutally and absolutely. But the suggestion that one can align all of the populations, as these organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have sought to do, between, they say, the river and the sea, and suggest that because Israeli citizens in Israel, Arab and Jewish, have a different status to Palestinians living within the Palestinian autonomy, that therefore there is some form of apartheid that exists. Now, we're British citizens sitting here, but an Israeli that comes to visit has different rights under English law to British citizens. Likewise, even post-Brexit, an Italian who might come to visit. So it is every country's absolute prerogative to give its own citizens the rights, and with that come obligations, of course, that non-citizens don't enjoy. Nowhere else in the world is this pointed out as some sort of discrimination.
And presumably the people making that case would not be happy if Israel were in charge of those areas.
Well, indeed, and part of the negotiated peace agreements, the transitional agreements, interim agreements, if you will, the Oslo Accords, were specifically to give the Palestinians the autonomy that so much of the international community has desired. And again, it is an aspect of this discussion which is often lost, especially when we're hearing talk of this supposed two-state solution. The fact of the matter is that the Palestinians have self-governance in the West Bank and in Gaza. The consequences of that have not been in any way ideal for the ordinary Palestinian civilian, but that is whitewashed, it seems, by international discussion.
Does Hamas even want a Palestinian state?
Hamas have been clear that their objective is the eradication of Israel. That is consistent also with Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy, with the Houthis. So there's a pattern here. Had there been any desire for a Palestinian state or Palestinian self-governance, then Hamas would have used the opportunity or even the Palestinian Authority in Gaza at the time would have used the opportunity of Israel's withdrawal in 2005. Let's not forget, Israel withdrew unilaterally. It ripped Jewish families from their homes. It ethnically cleansed the Gaza Strip in pursuit of peace, because the Palestinian demand has consistently been that there will not be a single Jew in Palestinian-controlled territory. That has been the case when Gaza was ethnically cleansed. It is also the case in the Palestinian-controlled areas of the West Bank, particular Area A. And nonetheless, in those contexts, no attempts at state building were actually made. So I think all of the evidence tells us, unfortunately, the answer is no.
In the post-October 7th moment, maybe it might have been naive to think that people could understand Israel's predicament, to understand the fact that it is living amongst neighbours who would like to see it wiped off the face of the earth. We feel further away from that understanding than ever. Does that disappoint you? What do you make of how the world has, if anything, turned against Israel at its moment of most need and peril?
It is extraordinary. I think it's extraordinary that we don't seem to learn from history, and perhaps even more extraordinary that we haven't learnt, or some in the international community engaged in this discussion haven't learnt from the last 12 months. And the constant references back to, the old framework, and in many respects, I have to say, Western mentality and approach, which may have been understandable before the 7th of October. But after those atrocities, and after the consequences of the international community's pressure on Israel to make security concessions have been laid bare, have been made so clear, there are no excuses anymore to revert back to these old adages, these suggestions that, peace will be possible if you will it. Peace has not been possible, no matter how desperately Israelis have willed it, because there has been no partner on the other side. To be able to, many in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict have said, you make peace with your enemies. I'm afraid I don't think that's right. You make peace with your former enemies. You make peace with those who have given up on their desire to annihilate you. Otherwise, you cannot possibly hope to achieve a situation in which you make those security concessions and they're not simply taken advantage of.
Does the elimination of some of the key figures in Hamas, we're speaking on the week where Yahya Sinwar was killed, we've had various heads of Hezbollah killed in recent months, does that give you any pause for hope for peace, or are there just more troubles to come, especially as people seem to still not understand that there might be any justification behind the war?
Well, it's definitely progress. It's significant progress, and it is a very important step in combating terror. There is ultimately no political or diplomatic solution to dealing with an internationally prescribed terrorist organization like Hamas that has been facilitated to take control of the Gaza Strip and to embed its terror infrastructure in such a fashion. A military solution in part to that is inevitable. And what we have seen in terms of much of the leadership of Hamas that has been decimated, as well as a lot of the leadership of Hezbollah that has been eliminated, is an integral part of starting to deconstruct those terror organizations. It's also, of course, a significant element of Israel's war aims, which was to destroy Hamas as a political and military organization, as well as to return the hostages. And there's been much discussion over the last few days about the potential impact of the removal of Yahya Sinwar as an impasse to the negotiations for the return of the hostages, that may present additional opportunities to secure the release and recovery of many of those that are still alive. But it's inevitable that there will be another individual to take Sinwar's place. That is not because of Israeli military activity, that is because of the organisation that Hamas has been allowed to build up. And critically, and this is something that sits very much at the door of the international community, the indoctrination that they have facilitated, importantly through UN-run schools, UNRWA schools. 3/4 of the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October last year were educated in UNRWA-run schools according to a curriculum that indoctrinates kindergarten children up to believe that the highest calling in life is to kill as many Jews as possible. And when you have that situation being perpetuated with international funding to these schools in the context of that curriculum, then you're generating further Yahya Sinwars in the future. That is the key, I think, to combating the perpetuation of the conflict and to generating the circumstances in which peace might be possible in the future. But as long as kindergarten kids today are going through that indoctrination process, peace is being pushed further and further away.
And finally, have you lost any faith in international law or the international kind of legal system when you have a situation where Israel can be dragged through the courts on what you see as spurious grounds, or we have the UN, as you said, essentially acting as a kind of shield for Hamas? Does it call a lot of those institutions into question?
Well, it certainly calls those institutions into question, and there should be accountability, both for UNRWA's involvement and also now UNIFIL's complicity, if you will, with Hezbollah crimes in the south of Lebanon. As a lawyer, I wouldn't say that my interaction with international law has ever been faith-based, but I do think it is having a desperately negative effect on the credibility of international law, on the ability for actors in the international legal arena, so primarily states, to place their faith in an international legal order, a rules-based system that is being so abused and so manipulated. And that, unfortunately, Fraser, has really dire consequences, not just for Israel, but for the future of the international legal order and for rules-based countries, the UK, first and foremost amongst them, from our perspective, to be able to have, I suppose, faith in the ability of the international legal system to hold the real abusers of international law to account. That is what is at stake. And unless we are willing to take a strong stance on the proper application of international law and to push back robustly on its abuse and the context of lawfare that we have seen erupt in respect of Israel, then I think that will be a very sad day when these international legal institutions simply lose their ability to be taken seriously.
Natasha Hausdorff, thank you very much.